My name is Curt Davis. I graduated from high school in Toronto, Ohio in 1940. And in 1941, I did what is called ran away from home because at that time you had to be at least 21 years old to do whatever you wanted to. Anyhow, I wound up in Oakland, California, ragged clothes, nothing else. I decided I was going to go enlist in the Army. I went to the post office and I wound up, I couldn't enlist because I needed either a parent or a guardian to sign papers for me to get in the Army. I went out of the post office, I went down the street, the first man I passed, I told him the same story I told the recruiting sergeant. He took me by the arm and he said, "Come on, son, I'll sign your papers. I'm from St. Louis." So anyhow, I enlisted and I volunteered for service in the Philippine Islands because it was on August the 12th of 1941 and we weren't in the war or anything at that time. I went to the Philippine Islands aboard the President Coolidge luxury liner as a private, and we docked in the Philippines on September the 26th of 1941. We took our recruit drill and everything. I was with at that time, the 698th Ordnance Battalion. And shortly after the Japanese had started to take over the Philippines, I was transferred to the 31st Infantry Regiment. We were bombed 8 hours after Pearl Harbor on what was December the 8th in the Philippine Islands instead of the December 7th in the Philippines. I received my first Purple Heart from receiving shrapnel in my right biceps of my arm on the first batch of bombs that hit. And two of the other guys from the same organization I were with were both killed on that barrage. We finally started to move toward Bataan, which was part of the original plan if we ever had to do anything. And that, of course, original plan was from Douglas MacArthur before the Philippine Islands was ever in the war. We got to Bataan, and I was already with the 31st Infantry Regiment when we got there. And we generally made our meals out of either horse meat or when the horses were all shot and dead. Once in a while, we might get a monkey, but if you shot a monkey, they screamed so bad, you could hear them all over. We didn't want the Japs to know exactly where we were. So we finally finished off all the horses as well as the mules we had eaten. On April the 9th of 1942, General Wainwright had no choice. He had the replacement for MacArthur when MacArthur left and went to Hart. When he left and came home and wound up being the general commander when we started coming back into the Far East and avenged Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. I was at prisoner of war camp number 3, Cabanatuan, on Luzon in the Philippines, and had been wounded the second time early in April, and on the night before the Philippine Islands were surrendered entirely to the Japanese. And I was in the hospital, having been taken in with shrapnel in my left foot. After the shrapnel in my left foot, I was in the hospital about 10 days, wound up at Cabanatuan. My foot was so bad, I couldn't hardly walk or anything, and there was no medicine or anything, but a doctor by the name of Captain Long, who was watching my foot, told me that the Japanese were moving some 2,000 prisoners from camp, and they were going to be sent to either Korea or Japan as prisoners of war, which we already were. He told me that if I could make it to the truck that would be taking some of the prisoners to the Philippines where they would be put on boats, that he would see that I got past to get on the truck. And then when I'd get off the truck, I'd have to manage to be able to get wherever they were taking us. And this I did. We sailed from the Philippines and we docked in Japan on what was then Armistice Day, which is now Veterans Day, on November the 11th, taking over 20 days on a trip that normally wouldn't take a week. I was assigned at headquarters camp in Tokyo and was there and was sent out to unload ships and so forth, just like any other prisoner, and I managed to do it on my bad foot too. On April the 2nd of 1942, a lot of us from headquarters camp were split up, and I was with a group of 11 Americans that wound up being assigned to a steel mill, or what we call a steel mill, in Tokyo, which the actual name of was Osaka Zozen. And I was there at that POW camp working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week at that mill until the B-29 raids had got so bad throughout the area that they closed that camp and sent us to a copper mine up in the mountains. During the time I was there, of course, I had got watercolors and poster board and other board from the Japanese black market people who were at our steel mill where we were working, and while POWs watched at night, I watercolored pictures and wound up making a small American flag, red, white, and blue, with 48 stars, which we wound up pledging allegiance to every morning the rest of the time we were in that camp, while the British stood guard watching for any Japanese so we wouldn't get caught. Eventually, the Japanese found my flag where I'd kept it hidden, and I spent 3 days kneeling in a Japanese jail, I would call it. We didn't call it that, but that's technically what it was, with a guard standing over me, and anytime I'd start to lean over or anything, I got a whack or two across my back with a wooden pole. After I got out, after the 3 days, I went back to the barracks, went back to work at the steel mill, and the day after I got out one of the other prisoners was cleaning the Japanese office, and he saw my little flag in the trash can, and he got that flag and gave it back to me. And that little flag, along with watercolors I had done and posters while a prisoner there, are all in the Prisoner of War National Museum in Andersonville, Georgia, where I donated all those things in 1982. At the copper mines, I had pretty well learned how to act like I had had malaria, because I had malaria a lot of times. And I didn't go to work too many days down in the copper mine with other people, because I pretty well knew how to pretend I had malaria even when I didn't. And I was never caught doing that. So one thing the Japanese did, they put me on a red pill, which I took every day, which was about the size of a quarter. And the amazing thing is, where quinine never helped or anything like that, when I got it on Bataan, I never had malaria again since the time I took those pills for the rest of the time I was there. On the 29th of, well, the last day anybody worked in the copper mines was on, I'm sorry, the last day was on August the 14th of 1945, and the Japanese brought all the prisoners in from work, and they never had to go out to work again. We had a pretty good idea that the war was over, because I had been getting from the black market people at the mill the English printed newspapers that came out up until the just before the surrender at the end of August, and the 14th was, we had an idea, was when it actually ended. We were on the 26th, I think it was, of August, why B-29s came flying over our camp. We all ran for foxholes and stuff. And as they came over our camp, their bomb bays opened up, and they dropped bags and bags and bags of food and things like that. Most of them landed outside of the camp, but the Japanese took us under their own guard, and they took us out, and we brought those bags in from outside, and we started eating good American canned goods, candy, and other items. On November, I'm keep thinking November was again that time. On August the 29th, the B-29s came over again, and instead of food or anything, they dropped tons of leaflets. And some of them came into the camp, and the Japanese took us out under guard and let us get the leaflets. The leaflets let us know that the war was over, and we would be taken by train to Tokyo, where we would be turned over. We would be taken under Japanese guard to Tokyo, where we would be turned over to American forces. And that was on September the 4th of 1945.
Curt, if you will, tell me, you mentioned earlier some poems. And I think those poems are pertinent to a bit of the feelings of what it's like when you oftentimes are out and you feel alienated and feel life is hard and you wonder really who's there. Could you share some of that?
Best thing about that, George, is the fact that most of those I learned after I was a prisoner in prison camp, so it's factual though.
But
Okay, first one I think is the one when I first got to the Philippine Islands. The old timers that had stayed in the Philippines, the ex-army people who decided to stay there as civilians and married Filipino women, had children, were working, they owned bars, they owned restaurants and different things. What they used to say when we got there, and I learned and loved it and still do and love to quote it, is about the Philippines, which is technically before the war. And the poem, written by we don't know who, but probably one of those or more of those permanent residents in the Philippines, was down where there are no 10 commandments, and a man can raise a thirst, lie the outcasts of civilization, victims of life at its worst. Down on the gin-soaked islands are the men that God forgot, victims of the ever-present fever, the itch, and the tropical rot. Nobody knows they are living. Back home, they are soon forgot. Vermin at night on our pillows, ills that no doctors can cure. Hell no, we're not convicts, we're U.S. soldiers on foreign tour. That was that one. The second one came about, was written by a Marine on the Philippine Islands, and I might mention the fact that when the 9 of us got over to Corregidor, the night Bataan surrendered, I was attached to the 4th Marine Regiment, which is the only Marine regiment in the Philippine Islands when the war broke out. And this was written by a Marine, although nobody knows whether he's alive or lived or died before even the war ended. Once Bataan had fallen, all the Japanese airplanes came in, and they came in droves regular, and bombed Corregidor all the time. And this Marine wrote, he's talking about now, you remember, a lot of you do anyhow, the posters that Uncle Sam was on, where I want you for the Army, or I need you, and this type of thing was still used after the war in recruiting. But the old man with the whiskers was looking straight at me. He said, your country needs you, so I signed up for 3. The recruiting sergeant told me of the life which was the best, but not a word was said that day of the motors in the West. So now I'm here, the war is on. You never would have guessed that this small phrase should mean so much. Flash motors in the West. Somewhere the sun is shining. Somewhere there's peace and rest. There's peace no more on Corregidor. There's motors in the West. But MacArthur's men, which after MacArthur left, they substituted Wainwright, who took his place running the Philippines. But MacArthur's men will carry on and each fellow would do his best to throw a monkey wrench into those motors in the West. And that I also learned during the time I was in prison camp. I spent 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days at the steel mill in Tokyo, and it was at the copper mine from July the 4th of 1945 until we were moved out of there in September of 1945. And my left foot technically has never, ever bothered me again since that time, although I have congestive heart failure, which is partly, I guess, due to my feet and my other conditions. But anyhow, I believe I stayed in the service for a total of 13 years. 4 months and 11 days before resigning my warrant officer position with headquarters of the 4th Infantry Division in Frankfurt, Germany, and resigned to take a civilian job. Back to that for just a minute. I had an accident on St. Patrick's Day. I was commander of the American Legion in Frankfurt. I was the first elected American Legion commander that they ever had, because they were all department civilians before that time, because I had already been a commander of the Legion at Fort Knox, Kentucky, before I went over. And the fact that a lot of the people in the Frankfurt, say the soldiers in the Frankfurt area, knew who I was at Fort Knox. So I guess that one, it took about, I turned my resignation in December of 1954. My youngest son had been born in Frankfurt, the hospital, on November the 28th. I turned my resignation in, and it was accepted by the Army in the middle of January of 1955. Prior to that, I took my family. At that time, I had 7 children. We flew from Frankfurt to New York City. My family was put on a train that night for Ohio. I was taken out to the center of discharges and so forth, and the next day I was discharged on January the 25th of 1955, and flew back to Germany as a civilian that same day, because my passport and everything was already arranged for by the company I was with. And that's technically about that. I've been in sales ever since, of some kind or other. Retired as an area sales manager in New York and New England states. Took early retirement when I was 57 years old, and my wife and I had operated a full-time antique shop. We moved to Burlington, North Carolina, and moved into the house we bought on December the 23rd of 1980. 85, and we've been real pleased living in Burlington ever since.
Well, Curt, let me, there's one other point that you told me, and I really, really think that hits at the heart and soul of what oftentimes service and some of the factors that enter in. It's the human image, the mind, and the consequences of involvement, oftentimes being alone. And let's see if we can put that into sync with what you mentioned to me with the other poem that you talked about.
Okay, George, I'm wearing a uniform. I'm wearing a uniform, I think. I normally like to close my talks with a poem about the uniform, of which I am so proud of and everything, and the fact that I served under and wearing that uniform. And I know that most veterans are just as proud that they wore it as I am. In closing, I want to tell you about the uniform, and I sincerely hope that you can all keep it in your minds and think about it on what I'm saying. The uniform. We're not ashamed of our uniform, and if you are a friend, you'll not say against it any words that may offend. It has covered heroes' bodies, and by heroes has been worn since the day of the Republic, when the stars and stripes were born. Uniforms have many patterns. Some are khaki, some are blue, and the men who wear them are of many patterns too. Some are of wealthy parents, some are college graduates, some have manly virtues, some are simply reprobates. Men of all kinds, when they're drinking, misbehave, racked up and swear. Drunken soldiers or civilians are disgusting anywhere. Grant us in this kind forbearance. We'll appreciate it more than a lot of noisy cheering when we're leaving for a war. If you meet a soldier on the street or anywhere, he doesn't rate a sneering glance or patronizing stare, for we have an honored calling, as our garments plainly show. You may be thief or parson, how on earth are we to know? We don't care for your profession, occupation, what you do. If you're looking at a soldier and he's looking back at you, who on earth is there to judge you as you stand there man to man? Only the one, the great Almighty. Name another if you can. Drop your proud and haughty bearing and your egotistic pride. Get acquainted with the soldier in heart and soul inside. Test and try to analyze him, criticize him through and through, and you'll more than likely find him just as good a man as you.